on the Sabbath if you really had to, into something that would punish a person.
Yeah.
So it's like they looked for something wrong with someone else so they would feel better about themselves.
Sure. And especially since they were connected with Christ. Even more so. More so, yeah.
That was key.
Need to apologize for the folks at home. I turned off the audio earlier and thought I'd turned it on, but we did not. So we've had a few people reports they couldn't hear, but you should be able to hear now. I think that's a good point, Pat.
Oh, I couldn't figure out what you really wanted to do.
Yeah. We were looking at the question, what are some points from these three accounts that one must study to have the complete story? And what we're talking about there is the instance where his disciples were eating grain on the Sabbath, and the Jews had a problem with that, and Jesus essentially calls them guiltless. The fact you brought up a while ago what the old law said on it is very important to understanding the complete story. Yeah.
That's in 23 verse 25. Mark it.
Of Leviticus?
Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy 23, 25. Yeah. Were any other answers on that?
You also have to have put the tale or reference that Christ made to David. I mean, it was not lawful for anybody but the priest to eat the showbread,
Right.
except that the priest gave it to David to eat.
Yeah.
When he was in need, when they were hungry.
Right. And what was
I
it?
don't think that's meaning that they were hungry because they hadn't eaten since breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was hungry because they hadn't eaten for more than a day. You
Sure.
know, I believe that here, that it's not, they're not describing hungry as how we would feel at lunchtime because we haven't eaten since breakfast. I'm thinking there's more hunger there than just they missed a meal.
That's a good. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. Yeah.
I know it's true with David.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about the David situation with the showbread, if I remember correctly, it was the old bread that they gave him. They had swapped out for the new bread like they were supposed to, and had given him the old bread.
But I don't think it still was lawful for anybody but the priest to eat any of the showbread.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Any other thoughts? All right, and the third question is, what is the significance of the statement, the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath? And this, of course, is talking about Jesus. And he's the one that is instructing the apostles and approving of the apostles eating here on the Sabbath day. So what would that say about Jesus?
That he has more authority than the law. What he came to earth for as he can pass the new way that God is going to deal with man. So he has authority over the law.
Okay.
He says.
And that's an interesting way of wording it. I hadn't thought about that. Authority over the law. Thing is, he knew the law. He knew the intent. And if his judgment on the situation was authoritative because he knew the law itself. He wasn't even contradicting the law. He was making certain that they understood that what the apostles were doing weren't even a violation of the law.
Well, and he's also the person who's supposed to be being honored.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And if he gives them permission to do this, then it's fine. And that goes back to what Karen was talking about. Yeah. John.
They didn't have a law against cooking on Sabbath, did they?
I don't know. Pat, you were in 25 of Leviticus.
23 verse 25.
Why am I keep saying Leviticus?
That's
I'm
Okay.
Deuteronomy.
What you were talking about, though, wasn't specific to the Sabbath. It was specific to, for any time. So I'm not convinced that they could do it on the Sabbath, other than
That's what I
Christ
was
said it's
wondering.
okay.
If cooking wasn't allowed,
Yeah.
I mean, if cooking
There
wasn't
we go.
allowed, then it seemed like what they were doing was equivalent to fixing a meal. They were creating their own meal as they walked.
Be honest with you, I did not anticipate y'all to be that particular in looking for details. You know, it's, you would think in preparing for something you'd be ready for that. Actually, okay, I tell you what keeps coming back to my mind, and we'll have to look at this later, is the manna. All right, what were the laws regarding, or the instructions regarding manna?
That's so many days you could pick it for.
Exactly, yeah.
And then the Sabbath, you
Only
got-
what you could use for today, except on Friday, and then you needed to pick enough for Saturday, because that was the same thing you could pick up.
Exactly. And if they went out that morning, they'd find nothing on the ground. And so I think what we're looking at here is whatever they consumed on the Sabbath day, there was probably, if we research this, and I'll have to research it for the laws on it, it was probably enough allowed so that you might have the food and consume the food. Whether or not you could go for hours in preparation, I suspect that was probably not allowed. You know, just based on the general principle. But I can't say for certain. I'd have to research that better.
I know the Bible doesn't put everything in this one little neat package where you can just understand it. You gotta search, and you gotta compare as to where they're going with this particular thing. I don't know where we just have it easier, but we know.
All right, I have a quick idea here real quick. We'll do this and take off. We will ask the all-knowing Google, what was the Sabbath laws regarding cooking? All right. Actually, I say that quite jokingly, but what happens is you will find websites that have already researched this. The Sabbath, there was to be no, all right, Leviticus 23 verse 3 is where this is bringing up to. And no manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. Exodus 12 verse 26. So that is what is meant by the phrase, do no customary work. It means that all the normal work must be suspended for those days, except the work of preparing the feast meal. Now that would be in regards to the Passover feast there. Let's see. Numbers 15:32. I think this is what Miss Marshall was talking about. Now while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron, to all the congregation. They put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then Yahweh said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. Now the question is, was he stoned? What was the reason for which he was stoned in that case? Because he's gathering sticks, doing the work there on that. So that doesn't help us a whole lot, and there's probably not much on it as far as other than what was needed so they might consume the food that day. But anything that they would have to go and gather, all the gathering was to be done beforehand. You know, like the sticks for the fire, anything that they would have that would have to be probably be even prepared the day before. You know, much like the Passover feast. You know, when it was prepared versus when they consumed it. Pat.
Would I be wrong to assume that the women did that work of gathering sticks for the fires for food, since didn't they prepare it? I mean, I'm asking, I don't know. I'm assuming they did, and that's it.
Be honest with you, I couldn't answer that reliably. I'd be guessing.
No, I don't know either.
I feel like I've guessed enough now as it is. But I think we're real close to the ballpark. You know, what was going on here was enough so they might be fed on this day. It doesn't qualify as gathering. It doesn't qualify as work. But from the Jews' perspective, it did, though. And this goes back to they make for doctrine the commandments of men. You know, and so sometimes we want God to give us more answers than what he did. Well, the Jews created these answers. you know. And so they filled in the blanks, so it'd be a whole lot easier to make the decisions and maybe even to judge people, you know, maybe, yeah.
I think that's the biggest issue is we tend to judge people too quickly on our own thoughts rather than what is scripture. It's God's place to be judging.
Right,
You know,
yeah.
We need to be very careful.
All right, any other thoughts or comments on that? That's a good question. I'll see if I can't find, once we're done, I'll look it up, do a little more research. Any other thoughts?
The modern Jews of today will not even turn on electrical appliance on the Sabbath.
The modern Jews of today, yeah. Like I said, there's a reason why the Lord gave the Sabbath. The Sabbath was given for the people, not the people for Sabbath. It was given to make them rest because they worked 6 days, you know, and it was based on what He did at creation. You know. Miss Phyllis.
I think it started out as we should rest and appreciate, and it turned into you should suffer.
Yeah, I've heard people kind of argue that about the first day of the week. You know, we should be willing to go the extra mile and to suffer for the Lord. And we're not talking about just the one-time assembly. You know, and I was talking to a preacher friend of mine. He said, "Well, if that's true, if it's all about suffering, then why don't we meet at 3:00 in the morning?" I mean, if it's all about suffering, you know, why don't we make it as hard as possible? You know, and it sounds like that's kind of what the Jews did sometimes. So it's like the fasting thing. They really didn't fast the way that you would understand fasting to be. They would go through the motions and not eat for the day. But more, they'd make themselves look like they were the most miserablest people. You know, and it was for the praise of men. So, okay, any other thoughts? Sorry I don't have enough answers. He shouldn't have asked those questions anyway.
You have to almost know the Bible to answer those questions. And I think God did that on purpose because He looks at our hearts.
Well,
I mean,
you're not
yes,
wrong
no,
about that.
Are you going to judge people on this
Yeah.
statement here?
Yeah.
This one statement. Are you going to judge people there?
Yeah.
You need to really
Know the
have some
text.
balance.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And we'll look this. The answers, the Bible will tell us what it tells us about that. And I think that's a good, and then we'll go from there. Yeah. Good question, though. Let's see if we can find a question we know the answer to. Let's go to the next section, though. This picks us up with Matthew chapter 12. Got another controversy with individuals, the apostles here, and Jesus on the Sabbath day. Look at Matthew chapter 12. Let's go ahead and be turning there. We're going to be looking at verses 9 through 14. And we're already here on the screen behind me. Here we go. Now, let's bring this up. Matthew chapter 12, beginning there in verse 9. So, we have Jesus. He's departed now from this area. He goes into the synagogue. And we have an individual there who has, as it says there, a withered hand. A withered hand in Matthew chapter 12, verse 9. Let me get caught up to the right area with you. Now, so they're looking at Jesus here, and in Matthew's account, what is the question that they ask of Jesus? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Okay, now when you look at the other accounts, Mark and Luke, what you find is a similar breakdown of the story. In Mark's account, they are watching Jesus so they might accuse him. And in Luke's account, the scribes and the Pharisees, they are again watching him. So Luke says in verse 8, Jesus knew their thoughts. Mark, Jesus says to the man, come here. But in Matthew gives us a little bit more detail to this. They ask Jesus this question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So here's his reply. He says, what man among you, if he has one sheep and it falls into the pit, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? All right, there's the question. How much more value then a man is a man than a sheep? How would they have answered that question regarding the sheep and the Sabbath? Sure, you can go get the sheep out of the Sabbath, or you can get the sheep out of the pit or the ditch on the Sabbath. Why? Because the sheep's money, there's value there to it. Shepherd is very precious and all this other stuff. They made allowances for these things. Well, so and it was in their mind a good thing. So his question is, how much more value is a man than a sheep? So if you've got a man here who is withered, a withered hand, is he not much more valuable than the sheep? Therefore, how does Jesus word it there? It is lawful to do what? To do good on the Sabbath. Okay? So we step back, and this really opens our eyes to what the Lord intended with the Sabbath law. The Lord was not saying that you cannot do good on the Sabbath. The Lord never said you can't eat on the Sabbath. But what had happened through the course of time, they had perverted what the Lord had said to fit their own understanding. So Jesus says, yes, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So he says to the man, he says, stretch out your hand. Of course, the man does, and his hand is restored. And at this point, what do the Pharisees do? Yeah, they set out to plot against him. In our study through John, part of it had to do with his work on the Sabbath, what he was teaching that you could do on the Sabbath. The man that was healed, and he said, take your bed and walk. That kind of began the downward slope. But when Jesus basically equated himself to be God, when he said, I'm the Son of God, or made that known, then that really pushed them into the stage of wanting to kill him. Mark reveals to us, though, that something Matthew doesn't. There in verse 14 of Matthew, chapter 12, then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him. Mark says the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. Who were the Herodians? Yeah, you had, at least the way that it was explained to me, you have several sects of the Jews. The first two we are very familiar with. You had the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You had those two. But what was another group?
The Zealots.
Yeah, you had the Zealots or the Zelotes. And which one of the apostles was referred to as so-and-so the Zealot? Simon, yeah. Simon the Zealot. And then, I think there was one more. The Essenes are considered to have been a sect of the Jews as well. But here you have so it is suspected, and that's not spelled right, but anyway, it is suspected that the Herodians were a sect of the Jews that were loyal to Herod. The ones who would do Herod's biddings and maybe, bow a little bit there and give in to what Herod wanted. And so Mark says in his record of this that the Pharisees went to the Herodians because they would probably know better about how to arrange something that would set Herod against this Jesus. All right, any thoughts? Any comments about that? All right, let's see. That one was real simple. So which hand was withered? His right hand. Yeah, right hand was withered. In your own words, what would best describe the motive of the bystanders? What were they wanting to be able to do? Yeah, they wanted to find some fault with Jesus, something with which they could accuse him. What method does Jesus use to head off their thinking? Okay, using the scriptures and using their own teachings against them. They made allowance to save a sheep. A man is more valuable than a sheep. If you can heal the man, heal the man. It would be like in a modern day analogy, someone gets hurt on the Sabbath day. Can you call 911? Can you take them to the hospital? Do you have to call 911 that only non-Jews operate the vehicle? I mean, if you were to take it as strict as what they were trying to do it, then you couldn't even save a man's life on the Sabbath. And that was kind of, Jesus was using that against them, that yes, you can do good on the Sabbath. What do the Pharisees determine to do? Yeah, they wanted to destroy him. They set out to conspire conspired against him to how they could destroy him. Explain how people react today in a similar fashion when confronted with the truth. This doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes, is it possible when you confront someone with the truth that they get mad at you and turn on you? Yeah. The Bible promises that, the Bible warns us, doesn't promise, the Bible warns us, Peter does, that we're going to suffer. Okay. But depending on where you live and your family life and what you're coming out of, not everybody you disagree with is going to get mad at you. Some will, though. Okay. Some, especially if you're very direct in what the Bible teaches, they'll draw the proper conclusions and not like the proper conclusions. Some of them could become so much so that they cut off the friendship, they cut off the family relationship. It happened back then, it could also happen today. And we must not let that detour the stance for the truth.
Hypocrisy, though. How much work were the Pharisees doing, plotting about, going, running here and there, and going over to the Herodians and doing all, who's doing more work?
Yeah.
If they really, they completely lost the fact that the Sabbath was supposed to be a day of rest. They weren't even fulfilling that. They were so busy trying to catch him. They weren't resting at all.
Yeah. See, that's why I couldn't be a bad guy. It's just so much work trying to be a bad guy. All the underhanded plotting and scheming and arranging and secrecy, that's just a lot of work. But you're right, though. They went through a lot themselves just to do that. All right, any thoughts? Any comments? We do have, let me bring this up real quick. On our Facebook page, let's see, I'm not sure if this brought this up. Well, anyway, I'll go ahead and read the comment. This is about five minutes ago in the history of this. Sorry, my thing is being fussy this morning. It is interesting, and this Michael Davis, preacher up north, he says, "Isn't it interesting that many think doing good means indulging self-interest? The purpose of the Sabbath was also to have Israel think about God. Today, are we thinking more about ourselves or God?" That's a good point. A lot of times things become they sound good, but there's a lot of self-interest behind it. Yeah, that's a very, very good point. All right, any other thoughts or comments? Okay. All righty, let's see. All right, that brings us into the last question. So let's continue in Matthew chapter 12 with verse 15. All right, so in this next section here, we have Jesus. And as he continues there, he's, of course, what is he aware of? Yeah, that's right. They're aware of them plotting against him, and so he leaves them, and a great multitude follows him, and he, of course, heals the multitude. And this is continuing in Matthew 12, but also Mark chapter 3 as well. Now, Mark and Matthew kind of differ a little bit on the accounts. Matthew was really good about sharing Old Testament passages, prophecies fulfilled, statements in application within the life of Christ. And so we're going to look at Matthew first. And in this case in point, notice here in the text there, he warned them not to make him known. Here we have Jesus healing the people at this point, still early on in his teachings. He warns them not to make him known. Now, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by who? All right, good old Isaiah the prophet. And so here's what Isaiah said, and this is Matthew's narrative. All right, through inspiration, This is Matthew's narrative of the life of Christ. And so Matthew's making a connection here for the reader. Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit on him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoking flax he will not quench, till he sends forth justice to victory, and in his name Gentiles will trust. Okay, so let's back up here for just a moment, and here's the question. All right, here we have Jesus. They warned him, or he knew what was about to happen, so he departed. The great multitude followed him. He healed the multitude. He said, don't tell people about this yet. And he did all this, the teaching, the healing, because of what Isaiah said. So how do you think what Isaiah said applies within this situation? First off, who's my servant? Jesus, all right. My servant whom I've chosen, my beloved, all right, Jesus as well, in whom my soul is well pleased. Think back to Jesus' baptism. All right, what did God say from heaven? Yeah, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. All right, he says, I will put my spirit on him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. This is Isaiah's prophecy. When did, at least, what event did it appear that is, kind of, I'm going to say symbolically happen, where everybody knows who've been with Jesus that he has God's approval? The baptism, all right? Saw the Holy Spirit descending upon him like as a dove, okay? So I'll put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. What is the significance here about justice to the Gentiles? How had the Gentiles, as far as the Jews were concerned, how had the Jews treated them? Yeah, unjustly, in a manner of speaking. Okay. But now, the Lord would deal justly. He will declare justice to the Gentiles. Both, two different ways of looking at that justice. One, he would now bring the truth to them. We can look at Romans 9 and 10 and see how Paul references how all that unfolded and everything. But also accountability. All right, with what Jesus is now doing, and his message is now being preached to the Gentiles, and the new covenant would be brought, of course, to the Gentiles, we now have a full-fledged accountability. Not trying to indicate they weren't accountable before, but they're now accountable on the same level as the Jews because of the message that Jesus has brought. He will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the street. What is the image Isaiah is painting of this individual that he's prophesying regarding?
Not being forward. He's
Okay.
holding back.
Okay.
He's not focal.
All right. He's not telling them, okay, go to let everybody know what I did. He's not doing that yet. Okay, not forward. All right, his humility. All right, Ms. Pat.
He's also not going to quarrel because his word is his word. So there's no argument.
Okay. In any time, the 3 years that we see Jesus teaching, other than when he drives the money changers from the temple, does he take a forward, offensive type approach, if that makes sense? He never really got defensive, even, because his word, that's all that he would say. He never, when Peter drew forth the sword and cut off, who? Malchus, thank you. Cut off Malchus's ear. What did Jesus say? Good way. He doesn't say if you cut off one ear, take the other. He puts the sword away and he heals the ear. He wasn't about establishing a kingdom by force, by military might. He was very, as he says here, he will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. And he yet put all this together. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoking flax he will not quench, till he sends forth justice to victory. And this kind of describes his life. Wait, John.
I wonder what the Pharisees thought about that prophecy.
Yeah.
Not much.
Either they interpreted it a totally different way, or else they thought maybe when the Messiah came, eventually, that he was going to reach out to the Gentiles or something.
At that point in time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely not during their lifetime. Or, you know. That's a good point. Any other thoughts about this? If you look at the overall demeanor of Christ, this describes his demeanor up until he died upon the cross. You know, even then, he didn't fight, he didn't resist. When they took him, arrested him, tried him, and nailed him to the cross, he went as a sheep led to the slaughter. You know, and this kind of describes the demeanor there. But once he dies upon the cross, he's now brought forth justice to victory, if you would, and that's when things change. In his, because now he becomes king over the kingdom. Any thoughts or any comments?
I think we tend to forget that the Gentiles could have been righteous in and of themselves. They did not need, they were not under the Jewish law. And they had an opportunity to be righteous even though they were not God's chosen people. The Jews were God's chosen people because those were the people he was going to bring salvation to the world from. But the Gentiles could have been righteous in and of themselves.
Correct.
They could worship God and do whatever God commanded to them. We don't know what God commanded to them because all we have is a record of what he commanded to the Jews.
Right.
And so we don't really know the state of the Gentile through history.
Other than Paul's comment that they did by nature the things that were written in the law. Yeah. But yet they would still be judged by God based on what God expected of them. Yeah.
Really, that's what he expected of the Jews, that they would do by nature the things
Yeah.
of the laws, but they didn't. I mean, some did. I don't want to make a blanket statement.
Well, no, there were many who were not. You're right about that. Yeah. Well, look at the whole history of the people. Even Malachi. You know, you think by the time Malachi comes along and serves his term as prophet, he'd have a wonderful, righteous people. But he had individuals who were doling out violence to the wives of the youth by divorce. They were offering sacrifices that the governor himself wouldn't take. You know, they just a yo-yo up and back and forth, up and down. All right, any thoughts so far about this?
I think one thing God did get to the Gentiles through the law was the fact that he was a God that expected things to be done correctly the way he says, even and if you didn't, you would receive punishment. So I'm sure that caught their attention.
Yeah, yeah. All right, now quickly turn over to Mark chapter 3, verse 7. Like I said, Mark's account at this point is, he doesn't go into what Matthew does in regards to the prophecy. But Mark chapter 3, beginning in verse 7 there, notice here that in the text, there we go, just kind of a more of a summary of where Jesus is at now. He withdrew with his disciples to the sea. Again, we see the great multitude followed him. They followed him from Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and beyond the Jordan, those from Tyre and Sidon. A great multitude, when they heard how many things he was doing, came to him. Now, put that big old statement into Mark's little statement, and we kind of have even a greater idea of how many people were following him and from what areas. Definitely so much so that Matthew would see the Isaiah statement regarding the Gentiles coming into play here with this. So he told his disciples here that had a small boat to make it ready for him. He needed to get out away from the land that people were crushing down upon him. And you can kind of imagine that. You think about pick a lake, and you got a shore, and all of a sudden you got a mass of people, kind of following you, and you're walking, and you get to the shore and turn around, and there's this whole mass of people behind you, and the only place to go is to walk on water, which he could do, but he didn't do it this moment. So he tells his disciples, make the boat ready, and he could actually get farther out. But verse 10, for he healed many, and this is kind of explaining, of course, why they were following him so closely, so that as many as had afflictions pressed about him to do what even? Even to touch him. We see here a mob mentality, and not in a bad way that you would think about it. But this thing spread from person to person and became so great and so strong that the only thing, he was the solution in their mind to whatever was wrong with them. And if they could even touch him. And this wasn't the only time. Wasn't there some other woman who touched him and was healed? Sure. Yeah, she touched him. And he says, I felt it flow out of me, essentially, And so then verse 11, and the unclean spirits, whenever they saw him, fell down before him and cried out, saying, you are the Son of God. Some scholars say that Mark recorded his gospel account based on the teachings of Peter. And so you can kind of imagine Peter as an older man before his death describing to Mark the events that took place and how he would have said, listen, there was people following him because he healed them. And they pressed on him so much so that we had to take him out into the boat so that he could get away from them. And the people, even the unclean spirits, would fall down before him and say that you are the Son of God. This is the recounting that Mark is doing of this life of Christ at this point. But again, he sternly warned them that they should do what? Not make it known. Now here he's talking to at least in context, to the unclean spirits. But Matthew applies it to even the multitudes that Jesus was healing as well. Any thoughts? I think we suggested a couple weeks ago, maybe farther back, that it might even be the case that the reason why the unclean spirits would automatically, seemingly, acknowledge who Jesus was is kind of the whole concept that they couldn't help themselves. And think about us, the promise is that a time will come where every knee will bow and every person shall confess the name of Christ. It'll be too late at that point at judgment. But when you're in the presence of God, the presence of Christ, and I would even think the presence of the Holy Spirit, there's none of this, so how's it going today? There'll only be probably one set of words you utter, and that is an acknowledgement of who they are. You can't but help to do that, would be my suspicion. Any thoughts or any comments about this? Okay. The questions here real quick, and one place I've not followed very well. I don't think we've got any comments there, and we do not. Okay. So, with that being said, what did Jesus withdraw? Why did Jesus withdraw to the sea? According to Mark's account, at least. Matthew's account. Yeah, because you had them conspiring against him. Number 2, in your own words, make a list, or list the characteristics of Jesus from Isaiah's prophecy as Matthew 12:18 through 21 records them, and explain. And then examine Mark's account. We did that. What are some of the simple things that Matthew said, or that Isaiah says about who Matthew says applies to the Christ? Okay, yeah. All right, right off the bat there. My servant whom I have chosen, verse 18. What was the other one? He says also, with whom my soul is what? Well pleased. Verse 19. Would he quarrel or cry aloud? No, absolutely not. Would anyone hear his voice in the streets, as in someone walking down the street speaking to the top of their lungs? No. His approach, his demeanor would be very soft, very quiet, at least at the beginning. A bruised reed he would not break, and All right, what is the significance there? A bruised reed he would not break. What's a reed?
Frozen water, it's a stick.
Okay. All right. And let's say if some animal or some lumbering person was walking by and was to hit it pretty hard, it would bruise. All right, and eventually what would the bruise cause the reed to probably do? Fall over. And what you would eventually have to cut it off. You know, like you would any leaf that kind of gets broken, you want to go ahead and cut it off. But he says a bruised reed he would not break. And a smoldering wick he would not what? Quench, okay? You blow out a candle or a fire, but here it says a wick, so you would think about an oil wick maybe. You roll it down, the fire goes out, but yet it's still smoldering at the end. And if it's exposed, what would you normally do? You'd quench it, just so it wouldn't flare back up. And he would not even do that until he brings justice to victory. I think a very humble manner is what, and that was the word, Rhonda, you mentioned a while ago. Very humble manner, I think, is what is being described here by the prophecy of Isaiah. All right, any thoughts? Any comments?
He was just.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Isaiah, he was just. Yeah. Bring justice to victory. That's right.
Yeah, he wasn't even aggressive against those who were trying to kill him. He
Well,
showed
that's right.
no aggression whatsoever that I could read about it.
That's right.
I thought amazing.
That when you look at Christ, that would have been the better way to have worded it earlier, is that he was not aggressive in his approach. The only time that would even appear so is when he drove the money changer from the temples. Okay? But that they turned the house of God, the house of his father, into a house of den. Den of thieves is what it is, yeah. House of thieves. And but even then that wasn't aggression as it was sternness, discipline, you know. But the overall approach, he wasn't aggressive.
He did want him to know his authority.
Exactly. And he wouldn't back down. Especially the Jews, the people who should have known better, he expected a lot more of them. He came down very hard on them. Their hypocrisy and the teaching for doctrine, the commandments of men. Yeah.
And he told them how he felt. I mean, he knew how they felt.
Yeah.
And he told them so.
That's right. Exactly right.
You go back to the time that he was before Pilate and all those soldiers, and they were hitting him and spitting on him. I can't even imagine no aggression shown. I mean, he's God. I could never control. No human can control themselves that way, except for him.
Yeah. You think about Isaiah 53? It's someone taking the punishment who with a thought could have ended the punishment. You know, I mean, he could have called down a whole legion of angels, you know, hanging on the cross. He could have said, that's it, I've had enough. And been just, you know, in a manner of speaking, but not towards the will of the Father, obviously. All right, any other thoughts? All right, let's see, real quick in your own words. Okay, we did that one, and we talked about Mark's account. All right, any thoughts or comments before we continue in Mark chapter 3 and Luke chapter 6? And this one is where Jesus is about to select the whom? The 12 apostles, exactly. All right, now, let's bring the Bible program back up here. There we go. And since we are in Mark chapter 3, let's just plan to stay there. And let's start our review in Mark chapter 3. Let's start there in verse 13. All right, so here we have Jesus. He goes up on the mountain and he calls to him those, calls them to himself, those that he wanted. They came to him. So he appointed 12. And notice what Mark says, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. Okay? Luke doesn't give us that specific detail at the start. Mark does. Okay? Again, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have power to heal sickness and to cast out demons. So if anyone ever asked what was the role of the apostle, it was to be with Christ, They would be sent out to preach, and they would have power to heal sickness and to cast out demons. All right, this was Mark's narrative of what Jesus did and why he picked out the apostles there. Any thoughts or comments on that before we look at them? All right, let's start in verse 16. Let's start with good old Simon. Simon, to whom he gave what name? Peter, exactly. All right, and then we have James, the son of who? Now, this one is Zebedee. Yeah, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave, this is what I was remembering earlier, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, or Boanerges, or Boanerges. Boanerges. Anyway, Boanerges. Sons of Thunder, more energy. Anyway, so the name Boanerges, that is sons of what? Now, and there's a reason behind that. And he doesn't go into the details right now, okay? But there's a reason why he calls them the sons of thunder. At least there's an instant that tends to fit that, the name there. So we have Simon, we have James, and we have John. Now verse 18, who do we add to it? We have Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew. Bartholomew is possibly also considered, well, we got Thaddeus in here. Nathaniel, thank you. So Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, possibly Nathaniel there, being the same one. Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus. Now Matthew is also referred to as who? Is Levi. Okay, and so Matthew is Levi. Maybe brothers to James, or brother to James, the son of Alphaeus. We're not certain about that, because Matthew is identified in another location as, I believe it was, the son of Alphaeus. But they're not put together as the same one. That is Matthew and James. It's Matthew and Levi. Then we have Thomas. Then we have James, the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite. Now, when you look at Luke's account, we have Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, and Bartholomew. Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, sometimes called James the Less. Yeah, sometimes called James the Less. And Simon, who was called the Zealot. And then we have Judas, the son of James, Judas Iscariot as well, who became the traitor, is what Luke says. Mark says Simon the Canaanite, Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. And they went into a house. And so those were the 12 apostles that Jesus picked out so they might go and be with him, preach the word, and then have the power to heal the sick, to prove that what they're teaching, or for God to use them and to verify through what they did his authority in what they taught. All right, any thoughts, any comments? All right, let's see. Okay, real quickly then on the questions, what reason is given for selecting these men? And it's Mark's account that gives us the reason. So they would be with Christ, and then they'd be, what's that? That's right. They would have that power given to them. That's right. And they would also go and preach. That's right. Preach the word there. Number 2, list the names of the apostles, and then list as many prominent New Testament men as you can who are not among the list. I don't know why he wanted us to do that. I listed the apostles and thought, I'm done. For some reason, when I wrote down Thaddeus, I put down Bartholomew as a possible same name as Thaddeus. I'm not so sure why I did that. It is Nathaniel, that's right. And then James, the son of Alphaeus, we already talked about him. Okay. All right, any thoughts or comments so far in this study? Or we've reached?
You wonder if maybe he was wanting you to the author of the book was wanting you to talk about Paul, because Paul was also an apostle at a due time, and then Matthias that takes Judas' place.
Yeah.
The fact that, they're not listed in this original 12, but that's because they were not called at that time. Now, Matthias was apparently a part of the group that followed along because he had to have witness the things that Christ
Mhm.
had done. But then, of course, Paul being called out of due time.
Well, who was the other fella?
Barnabas?
No. Well, we'll come back to Barnabas here in a minute. But there were two, so-and-so and Matthias.
Yeah.
And I can't remember, I forgot his name.
I just saw it this morning when I was
See, you don't get picked as apostle. Everybody forgets who you are. It's going to be in Acts, though.
I was just looking at that.
Acts chapter 1. Let's see, verse chapter 15. Justice, okay. All right. You'd think they'd gone justice. They already had a Matthew. All right. So the reason why I mentioned it, what does it say about justice? He had been with Christ also. He'd have been one of the ones that traveled with him too. Barnabas. Some people suspect that Barnabas was considered an apostle as well. Only because he's referenced as an apostle, if I remember correctly, but in the context, it sounds like he may be using the term that he was sent out, but not in the same category as the actual apostles of Christ. Interesting. And Barnabas did a lot of teaching, a lot of effective work as well. So other prominent men, for sure, were very instrumental in the spreading of the gospel. All right, any other thoughts? All right, I'll tell you what let's do. We have reached the end of our time, both hour-wise and section-wise in our booklet. Now, what we will do, we won't have a class next Tuesday. I will be out of town. We'll have, let me look at my calendar here real quick. Because we've had so many breaks because of the weather, we'll plan to continue our study a little bit longer into April. We're clearly going to have to break this to resume it in the fall. But next week, the 6th, I'll be out of town. We'll meet on the 13th, but then the 20th, I'll be out of town. And then the 27th. What we may do is from the 27th, if everybody's schedule will allow, we will go farther into April than what we normally go, so we make more progress in the study. And then we'll pause it and resume it in the fall. That sound like a rough plan? Or a plan? Also, something I want you to be thinking about. And this would be next year's study and once the fall begins. Because of the weather and the winter months, would it be easier if we go up through November, but then we actually take a full break in December, January, and February, and then come back for March and April?
Yes. December is bad, it is Christmas.
Okay.
It would be better.
I mean, I hate to have that, but if we're going to break that long, then we would definitely go full in March, full in April, full 8 weeks there. And then that'd give us a month before our June meeting. So that's why we kind of stopped there at the end of April. But be thinking about that.
We can go to a couple weeks in May. I mean,
Yeah.
those of us who have kids, of course, well, it ain't gonna matter for us next year.
Yeah,
Well,
we're losing our last kid, so it won't matter.
Well, we're changing the way he's
Never
learning.
Yeah.
And yours will be graduated so
This year.
she'll be in college.
So unless we get some new blood in here with young kids, we're not limited by the school system.
Okay, you're making me feel very old. Thank you,
You're
Cindy.
used to it.
Don't count
I
out
think
that
when
we might.
Jeremiah
That's
was
true.
little when we started this, and now,
Yeah. So be thinking about, we could do that. We could go March, April, and May, if we needed to, taking off December, January, and February because of the months. Or because of the weather. Think about that, and we can talk more about that as we close it up. But March is going to be sporadic, just like bad weather time. So, yeah. All right. I appreciate everyone participating this morning in our study. Appreciate those who are viewing at home. We will continue this then again in 2 weeks, page 27. We're going to be looking at the Sermon on the Mount. So go ahead and read ahead the Sermon on the Mount. We're not going to read it verse by verse, but we will kind of break it down and talk about some of the key points of that. And so going to be, and then you got 2 weeks to prep for that. All right, appreciate all your time and your attention. If you would, John, dismiss us in the word of prayer, please.
Father, we're thankful for our study time today. We appreciate that we have such a easy convenience of gathering and studying together your word. We realize that we're blessed because of this, and not everyone in the world has this convenient opportunity as we do. Pray, Father, that we'll never take that for granted, and that we'll continue to study independently and to be grateful for times when we can get together and study with brothers and sisters. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.